If you guys watch my YouTube channel, you will know my life is one long morality lecture. I'm constantly lecturing everyone around me about ethics and politics and history and these things that interest me. And the people who stick around seem to like it. You know what I mean? I mean, she could replace me, I could replace her, but it works out fine. No, but, you know, my whole adult life, First Nations, Native Americans, Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, Mohawk, the Native people in North America, it's been a big deal to me. And my mom claims I was like that even as a very small child. She claims I was already lecturing the world about, you know, colonialism and genocide and indigenous peoples, indigenous languages when I was a really small kid, which is interesting. My memory of that is a bit later. She seems to remember it even earlier than I do. Like, I came out of the womb pissed off about these issues. But, you know, part of my life that I didn't anticipate was that when I moved to Asia and started being a scholar of Asian languages and Buddhism, history, and politics, and so on over here, was that I really found myself explaining to Asian people the history of Canada and of Australia and these other places from a totally different angle and perspective than I'd ever imagined, right? So when I lived in Laos, that's more than 10 years ago now, I think? Right, yeah, it is. So, I mean, Laos may have changed a bit in 10 years. Laos was emerging from post-war poverty and kind of communist control of information and just general podunk ignorance. But, you know, I talked to Lao people who sincerely believed that the map of the world was kind of like the video game Pac-Man, in that if you went off one side of the screen, you'd pop up on the other side of the screen, right? Like Pac-Man. So I met and spoke to some Laotian people who actually thought that white people were Aboriginal Australians. Because they said when you look at the map, there's like Sweden and Norway up there. And then you go off the map and then you come back and you're down here at like Australia and New Zealand. And they were not joking. They were not joking. They thought that like these terms like Indigenous Australian, Aboriginal Australian, they thought that referred to like poor white people in Australia who'd been there since forever because they thought that's how the map of the world works, right? Like, yeah, you just go a little bit further north from Norway and Sweden and then you see what I mean? It's you teleport around, right? So, yeah. Yeah. And, you know, I was in a position, I was not going to ridicule them or something. Yeah. But it's like, okay, so let me talk you through, you know, last 500 years of the British Empire. Let's have a conversation. Now, for them also, just mention, so I mean, Laos as a communist country, they have heard a lot about imperialism and about colonialism. But they've always heard it from kind of communist government propaganda, right? So naturally, like all people in countries where you're constantly inundated with propaganda, they soon become indifferent to it or regard it all as lies, which is in a sense a shame. I mean, I myself scrutinized a lot of Lao government propaganda, but very often it was kind of 9/10 true. And you really felt sorry for people because that propaganda was their only source of history written in their own language. But because of the 10% of it that was not true, they regarded all of it as false. So for a lot of them too, they'd be sitting there, listen to me, and they'd be like, whoa, all my life I've been lectured by this left-wing government about the evils of imperialism and colonialism, but I always thought it was bullshit. Because like for them, they grow up and it's like there's the reality of Coca-Cola, there's the reality of American movies, American culture, American video games, American like rock and roll music, or if they listen to rap music, you know, hip-hop music. And then there's this discourse from the government about oppression and colonialism and imperialism and cultural imperialism. They like to use that term, cultural imperialism. And to them, the reality of the immediate reality of what American culture is, completely discredits these seemingly ridiculous claims about American history. How can they believe that America is built on genocide? It just seems preposterous. It seems loud. How can they believe that Australia is built on genocide? It seems laughable. It seems ridiculous, you know. Because that's how they're learning about the outside world, and of course they know that their government lies to them about all kinds of things. To give you an example, like the Lao government will lie to you about an airplane crash. They'll never admit that an airplane crash. They'll lie about a boat sinking. Like, even little things like everyone knows this boat sank. Like, everyone has a cousin or something that died in this boat. I mean, not everyone, but you know what I mean? Like, enough people are within 6 degrees of separation to know someone who died in a boat that sank. And the government denies this ever happened, So, all kinds of ways the government discredits itself. So that was one element of it, was just dealing with this. Now, I mean, I guess another is, they did have the propaganda from the Christians, from the Christian missionaries. And it's really interesting. I mean, I guess to summarize, there are some Christian missionaries who try to promote Christianity as magical. And when you think about it, they're the more honest missionaries, like who just say, like, this is magical. But then there are the Christian missionaries who try to present Christianity as the religion of science and progress and westernization and democracy, which, of course, in a certain sense it is. If you live in a country like Laos or Cambodia or even Taiwan, different places, or Japan even, there's a sense in which, Christianity is the religion of the atom bomb. It's the religion of the U.S. Army and the nuclear bomb and, all those things. And the religion of Santa Claus and, Christmas toys and, of this new and strange kind of technology showed up. But those Christian missionaries and Christian education, which is definitely, it's a major alternative source of propaganda in these countries, that's being totally dishonest about the history of colonialism. And, of course, the reality of what even medieval Europe was, just the unbelievably horrible reality of what, medieval Europe was when the Christians really had political control of that part of the world, So there also, one conversation really sticks out in my mind with a guy who was very sharp. He was nobody's fool. He was a government official, within Laos. He was a member of an ethnic minority, so he did kind of question the government and questioned a lot of things. And he spent a lot of his time talking to foreigners, partly just to improve his English. He was one of these kind of free-thinking guys. But I remember he just flatly told me, when I told him, no, the Catholic Church has killed millions of people all over the world. They're guilty of forms of genocide you literally can't imagine, and that I can start describing for you. No, they used to literally boil people in a metal pot. They used to literally burn people at the stake. They used to literally torture people to death on a stretching rack. You know what I mean? The Iron Maiden, before Iron Maiden was the name of a rock band, was an actual method of torturing people. The Spanish Inquisition. But from my perspective, also the main point, because I'm Canadian, being how Christianity was spread as a religion in Canada and to First Nations people in the United States. Right. And again, I mean, he's living in a very propaganda-rich part of Asia, and he doesn't believe anything I'm saying, And I remember just saying to him, ask your priest. He had a European priest. He had a white man who was the head of the main Catholic Church in Vientiane, Laos, maybe for all of Laos. Yeah. But they had imported a white man to preach the word of God to them. I said, ask him directly. Ask him the reality. What happened to the people who were not Christian within France? Just even within France, the religious persecution in the history of France, because it was a French Catholic tradition there, as I recall. Maybe I'm misremembering, but I say, whether it's the example is the history of Christianity in Australia or Canada or even within France, they don't want to deal with stuff. So that's one whole category of how that stuff gets addressed. So I just dealt with this in the last couple of days. I'm teaching a course here at a university with university-level students. And unlike most white men who teach English in China, I'm not kind of pandering down to the students. I kind of say to the students, well, look, you guys are, you're mature adults. You're 21 years old. And they're basically education majors. They're people who are in training to become teachers themselves. So, I can put the content up here, and you guys can come up to me and deal with some university-level reading and university-level discussions. So lately we have dealt with First Nations in the following way. We had a whole series of lessons dealing with education, how the education system works in different countries, how it's different in Japan from it is in the United States, and these kinds of issues. Whole bunch of examples around the world and a bunch of student presentations on different aspects, some philosophical and some totally practical. Some of my lessons have dealt with philosophy of Aristotle and Plato, but some of them have dealt with how my students can make money being a language teacher in the United States or in Europe. Like, some of it's been really practical advice that'll impact their careers. So just saying, it's not all a morality lecture. It's not all about ethics and so on. And then I presented to them this fact that, okay, this is actually how I presented it in the same sequence. I said to them, look, countries like the United States and Canada, we're not poor. You know this. Our government is not running out of money. We have plenty of money in terms of the education budget and so on. And we just did a lesson where we looked at some of the most excellent universities and schools. We looked at sort of what are the leading best, what are the new ideas in education, what are considered the best of the best schools in United States, Canada, England, also Japan, and a few other countries. Okay, so we just look at the best. I said, but everyone says this, a lot of universities in the United States are terrible. A lot of schools in Canada are terrible. Why is that? Because money is not the problem. What is it? And I pushed them, so, trying to get some answers, and you get different answers. I said, okay, so the government didn't decide, because a lot of this comes down to government money. The government didn't decide we're going to make this school terrible and this school good. They didn't do this intentionally. It's not a conspiracy to just, intentionally punish some group of people. So just tell me, where are the bad schools? And why are the bad schools there? Why are these bad schools? And, try to press on. And again, we're practicing English, and they're practicing some creative thinking, because they really have no idea. They've never thought about this before. And I said to them, maybe you never thought about this, but in the United States, there are 3 kinds of schools. There are schools that were created for white people. There are schools that were created for black people. And there are schools that are created for Native Americans. And this blows their minds. And I start going into, with the U.S., I'm mostly talking about the university level of education. So what are called Indian colleges, universities that are actually run by band councils, by Native American bands, and how those are funded in contrast to historically black colleges. And we did. So then the next week, we got into the history of segregation and inequality in black versus white education in the United States. But that week, there's only so much you can do within one university lecture. So we mostly dealt with the differences between university level education for Native Americans versus white people in America. And then we got into the parallel questions in Canada. We have our own form of racial segregation and the unequal, just how our actual education system functions differently for white people versus Native people, and then for Catholics versus non-Catholics, and for Francophones versus Anglophones. There are a lot of these questions of various forms of segregation in one degree. But another one of the things that just amazed them, and this is such a simple thing, so the photocopy I gave them included the statistic. It said, there's more than one statistic you can get for this in terms of exactly the number of stuff. So okay, so you notice here on the handout it says in Canada today only about 6% of our population is Indigenous. Please don't bother me sending emails. Yes, I realize it can be 7% and it can be less, depending on exactly which definitions you use and which census data you use. But as I recall, the statistic I had was something like 6.5% of Canadians are Native, are Indigenous. And so then I said to them, okay, so you have that statistic. So what percentage of Americans, people in the United States, what percentage of Americans are Indigenous? And this was in this context, all this conversation leading up to it, and I'd shown them the map, and I'd shown them this college, and we talked about these tiny Native American colleges. Like, some of them are colleges, or theoretically they're universities, but they have like 400 students. Yeah. They're out in these remote areas, It's a really bizarre parallel universe of tertiary education for Native Americans, and how that's funded and so on. So all this is covered. And I remember one student, she was an intelligent student, who just guffawed at this. She just laughed at how impossible she thought the question was. But her final guess was 40%.
Wow.
And then she said 60%. I really don't know, so I don't think I have it here. But I had, partly to just reinforce the contemporariness of this question. This came up again in class today. One of the students said very casually that the native people of Japan, they're native minorities. Of course, Japanese people are native to Japan, but they also have other groups like the Ainu and the Nivki. They said the native people, they still engage in traditional hunting and fishing. And I stopped her. So, okay, so pardon me. This is all part of my job. I don't just let the students give a lecture. I do, Q&A. I said, did you actually see that on the internet? I said, is that the reality of how they live today in 2017? And I held up the picture I'd given them as part of the photocopied handout, because I intentionally gave them some photographs. They weren't just random Native Americans. They were Native Americans at a particular university, a Native American university, exactly relevant to the discussion. But I pointed out to them, look, this is what these people look like. They wear the same kind of clothes you and I wear. They have the same kind of jobs. They drive. They very much live in the modern world. They're not. They're not carrying a spear. They're not. They really live in the modern world with electricity and cell phones and all the same problems other people have in terms of education and everything else, right? So I wonder if it was for that reason this girl was seriously guessing, like, is it 40% or 60%? Because also to them, when they looked at those photographs of Native Americans, they can't tell ethnically. Like the facial features are not that different from white people. And this is legitimately the case in many instances, not always, but in many instances, there's no easy way to recognize who is and who isn't First Nations. But anyway, from a Chinese perspective, at least, we look alike. But she was really sincerely guessing, and the other guesses I got, likewise, they were way higher than Canada. Like, as if they imagined, like, the point of this lecture was like, whoa, like in Canada, they really committed genocide. Like, they were shocked. They were shocked to learn that only 6% of Canadians are Native people, right? But they thought, well, America's not like that. America's the land of the free. Like, I don't know. Like, maybe it is the political discourse about, like, democracy and freedom and human rights that America gives out that they really thought, like, America would be better. But I said, no. So these various guesses, I mean, some were more conservative, but they were guessing like 15%, 20% or something. I said, no, in Canada, 6% of our population is Indigenous. In America, it's down to 1%. Okay, now again, depending on which studies you use, census data or whatever, you can get a 2% figure, but 1% is the stat I'm going with, which is a U.S. Census stat, using a strict definition of who's Native and who's not. And I said to them directly, when only 1% of your population is Native, that means you've got 99% genocide. This is the reality of the world we've created in the United States and Canada. It's 99% genocide, So it's real, and it shook them up. I mean, they're not dumb. I mean, okay, I'm not going to say every single student in the class was really relating to this, but yeah, I'd say like above 80% of the students were really interested in this, and not nearly as many students were interested in philosophy of Aristotle. Yeah. Just mention it. Yeah, I would say honestly it was above 90% of the students were really like, whoa, this is a whole side of both world history and also just education. Because remember, they're all education students. This is relevant to their lives and careers. And I said to them also, I said, look, for your own employment, this is a way for you to get a job in the United States. You can look at these other school boards, whether it's African American colleges or Native American or First Nations and this stuff. Yeah. So there are actually job opportunities here because it's really hard for them to hire people. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there was a lot to it. So anyway, babe, if you want to say you want to jump in again, I got one note written down from today's lesson. I don't know if you'll relate to this or not.
I guess the comment is that I think your lessons are really, really well put together. These students. You
see what I put up with.
These students are really lucky to have you as a teacher.
Oh,
yeah, because
Thanks, Lebo. I mean, Anyway, I try to structure this stuff so I'm always learning. I mean, that's another element of the why I'm not depressed. I've learned so much this week. It's nuts, Mm-hmm. And in the next couple weeks, I'm not just working on Chinese now. Really, I'm working on Laotian and French. And in terms of history and politics and everything, I learn a lot from week to week. Yeah. I'm 39 years old. In some ways, my life's a disaster, and I don't recommend other people live the way I do. But in some ways, no, I mean, really, I don't recommend people imitate what I've done with my life. But in some ways, I'm like, yeah, I'm still learning a lot at age 39.
Yeah, and everything's genuinely interesting to me. So I also learn when you're researching these things. You'll tell me like what you've been looking at. So,
maybe someone will send us a question from Patreon. Melissa, is there anything Isel is into that you don't find interesting? I don't know. We listen to a lot of the same rap music too. But look, staying on topic here. So I wrote down one note on this. So one of the students said in her presentation, so she did a presentation dealing with First Nations, Native Americans, and these problems of education inequality. She said it was a reasonable statement, but I challenged her on it. It's reasonable but false, or reasonable but misleading. She said, well, it's natural that they have a lower quality of education in these backward areas. That's a very Chinese perspective. Like they were shocked also because this came up, not with all the classes, but with one of them. I said, it's not the case in America that like the best university is in New York City and the worst university is in Hawaii. Like University of Hawaii is a great university. Like it's just, that's not the way our system works. So they really think that way. They think, okay, the best university is in Beijing because that's the center, and then the further out you go, the worse it is. But I challenged it. So there's a normal Chinese way of thinking. Well, these are backward areas, therefore naturally they have bad education for Native peoples. And I challenged her. I said to her, look, I used to live in Laos. I used to live in Cambodia. I did humanitarian work. I also did teaching. I was involved in education and MISC stuff we're not going to describe here. I said, look, in Laos, I've been to backward areas. And I've been to areas where the school has no electricity. I pointed the lights. There's no electricity. And there is no glass in the windows. The school is made out of wood, and the window is just a hole in the wood. You know what I mean? There's no electricity. So if you want to teach after the sun goes down, you light a candle. Hordes of locusts fly in through the window. There's insects are attracted to the candle. Speaking from experience here, people. You know what I mean? The wooden and I said, and in that school there are no books. There are no books, and of course there's no internet access or whatever. Okay. That's backward. We're talking about the United States and Canada. All these schools have electricity. All of them have books. All of them have internet access. So you can read things on the internet or order books through the internet if you don't have enough books in the university library. But actually, even these small colleges, I'm sure they do have enough books around for what they got to do, on their topics. They're not poor in that absolute sense, right? So I said, what does it mean? Like, how is it an excuse to say these are in backward areas? What's the actual disadvantage? What does it mean to say they're in backward areas? And, I pushed her on this, again, because it's not easy for them to answer in English. And, she ultimately kind of said something like, well, I guess in backward areas, like people are just less scholarly and they're more lazy and drink alcohol and so on, which is actually a really honest answer. Mm-hmm. And then, actually I pushed further with that. And I said, okay, so that's an interesting point. So it's not that they don't have electricity, it's not that they don't have books. There's kind of like a lack of intellectual stimulation and a lack of scholarly culture or, academic culture, what have you. And, people are drinking alcohol. And I said, okay, but which one comes first? Because now I'm speaking in somewhat simple English here, obviously. I said, so is it that people drink too much alcohol and therefore they're stupid? Or is it that people are stupid and, therefore they drink too much alcohol? Like they're not enjoying their life. Like what does this really mean? And I talked through with them also. I was like, well, the huge impact if your parents drink, and not even that they're alcoholics, but if your parents drink instead of talking to you about history and politics or just even watching the TV news with you or whatever, just how different it is to have parents who drink alcohol every night. And they kept saying, oh yeah, alcoholics. I was like, no, not even alcoholics, just moderate drinkers. Yeah. But where that is your culture and that is your upbringing stuff. So we got into a lot of good stuff. And a couple of the student presentations were specifically dealing with education and alcohol, education and alcoholism, education and drug use. Sure. So we got student presentations exactly on that stuff. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, this is a long enough video. We're past 20 minutes. But yeah, it's a really interesting role I've played is introducing people in Asia to the basic concept that white people are not the indigenous population of Canada and what that means and why it matters. And yes, sometimes the discussion has been more about Australia or the United States or what have you. And seeing the political significance of that for them as it first dawns on them, as they first think about it for the first time in their lives, and they see all this other propaganda they've heard about colonialism and imperialism in a new light. And, I think the saddest part is that there are a lot of Asians who are living in Canada right now, Asians who've migrated from India to Canada, from China to Canada, from Cambodia to Canada, and they've never even thought through what I've just worked through with my students. They've never even had that much of an introduction to the history of Canada. And they may have even become Canadian citizens. Because let me tell you, Asian people in Canada are racist as hell against First Nations. That'd be a whole other video, but it's unbelievable and mind-blowing. New immigrants to Canada are not angels. They're not immune to racism. And very, very quickly they take on the attitude of, well, my family migrated here from China, and now we're rich, so therefore if you're not rich and you've been here in Canada for 500 years, it's your fault. Yes, and the new immigrants from India and Pakistan tends to be even more explicitly racist. So that's a challenge even within Canada we have to deal with, is the question of educating Asians about Indigenousness, about the past, present, and future of Canada.